I can assure you that what you will observe is a vast wasteland.
I would like to share with you a little story which might justify my being up here with this illustrious gathering. Some 45 years ago, I was living in London with my husband and children when the Dean of St. Paul's Cathedral organized a large rally for the campaign for nuclear disarmament. We were told to assemble in Trafalgar Square and were instructed to squat on the ground. We were also told to bring night things and a toothbrush, as we might have to spend the night in jail. I was determined to take part, and my daughter, aged 9, a very intelligent 9, insisted on coming too. She had painted a banner with "Ban the Bomb" on it. My husband was terrified to let us go, but he knew how passionate I was about it and did not prevent us. So off we went with toothbrush and all, and in Trafalgar Square there was this huge sea of people sitting on the ground. Of course, the traffic was completely disrupted, and the police had to try to move us. The only way they could do this was picking us up bodily, which they did, and whisked us off in large police vans called Black Marias. Many of the people did spend the night in jail, but I was eventually allowed to return home, probably on account of having my daughter with me. However, we were ordered to appear first thing next morning at the Old Bailey. I must tell you that the police were most gentle and considerate, and I suspect sympathetic to our cause. The judge, too, was very understanding next day in court, and we were all allowed to say our little piece. Well, now you know how passionately I felt about nuclear warfare all those years ago, and I feel even stronger now about all violence for that matter. I hope you think I qualify to tell you about our honoree for the Distinguished Peace Leadership Award, which is in its 20th year and has become a significant award. The previous honorees are an impressive group of individuals and can be found in your tribute program. Some of these include His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, Jacques Cousteau, Dr. Helen Caldicott, Jody Williams, Yehudi Menuhin, and King Hussein of Jordan. I first saw Jonathan Schell, our honoree, on the Charlie Rose show. I was impressed. I was very impressed. Subsequently, I read his latest book, The Unconquerable World, and I became one of his fans, and he became one of my heroes. Jonathan Schell is a writer and educator of great accomplishment. He began his career as a journalist in Vietnam. His reports helped people at home to understand that everything was not going as well as we were led to believe. He later turned his attention and intellect to the problem of nuclear weapons and wrote one of the seminal books on this subject, The Fate of the Earth, published in 1982. The book was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize. Jonathan Schell has continued to think deeply and to write about the terrible dilemma that nuclear weapons pose to humanity. He has written 14 books, and his most recent book, published earlier this year, The Unconquerable World. I would have liked to have read you some passages from this book, but time does not allow it. However, I urge you all to read The Unconquerable World. It is a truly great book. Jonathan has been a staff writer for The New Yorker and currently holds the position of Harold Williams Peace Fellow at the Nation Institute and contributes frequently to The Nation magazine. He is also an educator of some renown, currently a lecturer at Yale Law School and a senior fellow at the Center for the Study of Globalization at Yale. It is my great privilege and honor to present the Foundation 2003 Distinguished Peace Leadership Award to Jonathan Schell.
Well, I'm blushing. Thank you, Lainey Faye Blonde, for those beautiful and, I may say, superabundantly generous words. I think you can understand how deeply honored I feel to be in that long and unbelievably distinguished line of honorees for this award. And I may add, especially so, to be in the company of David Krieger of the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation, who has founded and led this. And I'd like to add my friend Richard Falk, now the chairman of the board. These are winter soldiers in the struggle against nuclear weapons, people who are there in the thick and in the thin. And for me, heroes have been mentioned, and they are heroes to me of the nuclear age. And that is a reason that I am so especially honored to be here this evening. One wonderful thing about being a speaker before dinner is that you can have asked the waitress already to pour you a glass of wine, knowing that you can fully enjoy it and a few more as well as soon as you have finished speaking and the butterflies are out of your stomach. On the other hand, for those of you who are listening, you may fear that you're never going to get to your dinner, so I want to assure you that will be not be the case. And I really urge you to partake of it and to partake of your glasses of wine, even as I speak. And if there's a certain tinkling out there, I want to guarantee that I'll speak quite loud enough for you to hear. Our occasion this evening is a lovely one, but we gather in a dark time. Our country, and what seems to me a wrong turn of truly epic proportions, has turned to force as the mainstay of its policy, not only abroad but increasingly at home as well, menacing and constricting constitutional freedom while approaching the world with a drawn imperial sword. And yet this evening I want to speak of something hopeful. I think that in the 20th century, broadly speaking, we have witnessed the bankruptcy of violence. You all probably know the saying, war is the final arbiter. And what it means is that if you want to find the powerful people, the people who are going to count, who are going to win out at the end of the day, look for the ones with the guns. And this was thought to be true in revolution, and obviously all the more so in war. And yet I want to question the truth of this assertion. I want to argue that in fact force, always a tragedy for both user and the one upon which it is used, has become less and less effective in deciding political matters. Indeed, the history of the 20th century, I argue, holds a lesson for the 21st, which is that in a steadily and irreversibly widening sphere, violence, always a mark of human failure and a bringer of sorrow, has now also become increasingly dysfunctional as a political instrument. And the way I see it, force has been squeezed on two sides. And the first is that at the top of the system, we have the nuclear weapons that the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation and others have fought against so strongly. But one of the things that has done is really to render war, per se, unthinkable between great powers. Of course, they can go ahead and blow up the world, but it will really have nothing to do with what we once called war. And that paralyzing influence, I think, reaches quite far down into international affairs. And I think it's a reason that we haven't seen as many conventional wars between fully fledged nation states as we have seen in past times. Now, those of you who are familiar with the work of this foundation know what this stalemate meant and what it still means. That our species stood and still stands on the brink of its annihilation. Now, you're probably imagining now that I will say again what I have said so many times and what the members of this foundation have said, that these weapons should be abolished. And in fact, I will say it. Let's get rid of them. Let's get rid of them all. Let's get rid of them in Iran, in North Korea, Pakistan, India, but also in China, Russia, France, and England, and yes, here in the United States as well. As John Kennedy said to his good friend, the British ambassador David Ormsby Gore, at the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, our world will never make any sense until we get rid of these things. That's John Kennedy. His insight, born as the responsibility for the future of the United States and the whole human species, bore down upon him in that mortal crisis, is as critical for the 21st century as it was for the 20th, even more so. And it holds true, of course, for all weapons of mass destruction. As a species, we should exit from the age of mass destruction. And yet this evening, I'm not going to talk more about that great, necessary, common sense objective of our time. For it seems to me that if you propose to get rid of something, in this case weapons of mass destruction, which stand at the apex of the system of force, you ought to have something to replace it with. And what's wonderful to me is that in the midst of the gruesome 20th century, something began to appear. Not yet perhaps a full-fledged alternative, but the beginnings of one, the foundations. Now, if I'm right in saying that at the superpower level, political matters cannot be decided by force, represented by the nuclear stalemate, then something else has to decide. And something else has, in fact, been deciding. After all, the Cold War was decided. Those issues were decided, to give one example. Now, what was that something? And this brings me to the other pressure that has been constricting warfare, or more specifically, imperial conquest, from the underside of the war system, so to speak. Empire is a political system based on force. But if we look at the recent history of empire, surely the most notable fact is that all of the empires that were standing at the beginning of the 20th century, the British, the French, the Dutch, the German, the Portuguese, and what have you, have all gone under the waves of history. And the same is true of the fascist empires that arose in the middle of the century. Now, the great pioneer in this effort, of course, was Mohandas Gandhi, who began his campaign against imperial rule at the beginning of that century. He was a man of faith, and he found the strength and motive for his kind of politics in faith. Reversing centuries of tradition which had taught that God was to be sought above all in monasteries and desert places, he said, "For God appears to you only in action." But if spiritual energies were to be released into the political world, they had to overcome a danger, that the intensity of the spirit and sometimes the fanatical energies of the spirit would be more destructive than constructive. And we don't need to go beyond the religious fanatics who attacked this country on September 11th, 6 blocks from where I live as it happened, to see how true that is. Or we can look to our own religious fundamentalists who look forward to something called the rapture, in which the faithful will be flown up to heaven while everyone else perishes. Now, what Gandhi had to offer was two essential correctives. He insisted that a spiritual politics must, on the one hand, be nonviolent, and on the other hand, must be fully tolerant of other faiths. And he insisted on something else that is equally important in this context, which is that he declared, and I would say that he in fact discovered, that not only should the power of government depend on the consent of the people, but that it actually did so, and that this was true of dictatorships as well as democracies. And what followed from that was that if the people withdrew support from the government, it would lose its power, bark orders to empty air, and fall. It took 3 or 4 decades, but we know the result. The British had to quit India in 1948. We might wonder, though, whether this was restricted to India. I think the end of the Soviet Union gives us the answer. Because the activists who brought down that Leviathan seemed to rediscover, but also to remodel and vary Gandhi's scheme. Václav Havel, the Czech dissident and later president of the Czech Republic, was not as religious a man as Gandhi, but he spoke of living in truth, a phrase that might serve as a very inspired translation to Gandhi's phrase satyagraha. And his living in truth stood in opposition to living in the lie, which meant living in obedience to the repressive regime. Havel wrote, quote, "We introduced a new model of behavior. Don't get involved in diffuse general ideological polemics with the center, to whom numerous concrete causes are always being sacrificed. Fight only for those concrete causes and fight for them unswervingly to the end." Why was this living in truth? He drew a contrast with what he called living within the lie, that is, conforming to the repressive system's demands. And by doing so, he said, individuals confirm the system, fulfill the system, make the system, are the system. He rebelled against the idea that a negative, merely responding influence was at the root of his action, and he rejected the label opposition or dissident to describe what he was doing. And he wrote, and I quote once again, "For people who have simply decided to live within the truth, to say aloud what they think, to express their solidarity with their fellow citizens, to create as they want, and simply to live in harmony with their better self, it is naturally disagreeable to feel required to think of themselves primarily as people who are against something, not as people who are for, not as people who are what they are." Now you might think that such advice directed to the inner person might be more appropriate in a prayer book or maybe in a self-help manual, something of assistance to the psyche or the soul rather than as political advice. And yet for Havel, this understanding that action properly begins with a predisposition to truth had practical consequences that were basic to his understanding of political power, and I quote him one last time. "Under the orderly surface of the life of lies, therefore, slumbers the hidden sphere of life and its real aims, of its hidden openness to truth. The singular, explosive, political power of living within the truth resides in the fact that living openly within the truth has an ally, invisible to be sure, but omnipresent, this hidden sphere." Thus did Havel, in 1978, foresee what almost no one else foresaw, the downfall of the Soviet Union. Now you might wonder why in the United States of 2003, I'm talking about Mohandas K. Gandhi in the early 1900s and Václav Havel in the 1970s. Well, for one thing, the two events that I have cited were scarcely marginal in the 20th century. These, after all, were the two greatest empires of their time. You'll recall that the British Empire was the one on which the sun was supposed never to set. And the Soviet Empire was hardly a detail of the 20th century either. Who would have thought that that colossus, with its immense nuclear arsenal, its Red Army, its KGB, all of those instruments of force concentrated in the hands of a totalitarian central power, would melt away one day like the morning dew? And who would have thought that this would happen substantially without violence? Who would have thought it? Well, Havel thought it, and Lech Wałęsa, the electrician who led the Solidarity trade movement in Poland, thought it, and they did it. We did it, Wałęsa told our joint session of Congress, without breaking a single pane of glass. I'm not going to give more examples, but I could give many. But I think if you look deeply enough at the whole story of the fallen empires of the 20th century that I mentioned, you'll find something similar down at the bottom of it. You'll find a story of the hearts and minds and wills of ordinary people, expressed above all politically, and only secondarily, if at all, in a military way. And now all those empires are gone. There is something in this world that does not love an empire. Another aspect of this business is perhaps a little closer to home and more familiar. Revolution without violence of the kind that occurred in India and the Soviet Union, but also in Spain, Greece, Portugal, the Philippines, Serbia, and many other countries that I'm not going to go into, has tended much more than the violent kind of revolution to lead to liberal democratic rule. And what is democratic rule, including our republic here in the United States, after all, but a means of governing ourselves without violence, of transferring power without tank fire at the local television station, without torture in the basement. So these two things, it seems to me, go together. Nonviolent revolution leads naturally to democratic government, and the one is a good and solid foundation for the other. And a third thing goes with them, and this, although this is less developed, but it's something very familiar, and I mean simply the growth and observance of law internationally, in the form of agreements, treaties, international organizations, governmental and otherwise. I'm not talking about a sudden replacement of war as a system, with a system of law on the order of the League of Nations, which didn't work. I mean a gradual growing and strengthening network of treaties, international bodies, governmental and non-governmental, that gradually give us the means to conduct our business without force. These means are the counterpart in international affairs of nonviolent revolution at the level of the street and liberal democracy at the level of the national state. I mentioned the nuclear dilemma earlier. And under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, 182 nations have agreed to do without nuclear weapons. The treaty provides in its Article 6 that the existing nuclear powers should join the 182 in living without nuclear arms. And this is the way, not through a series of so-called counter-proliferation wars, to proceed with the elimination of nuclear danger. If I'm right that nonviolent political power, sometimes called people power, both is at the bottom of the collapse of the world's empires in the 20th century and is a promising new foundation for democratic government, then what a colossal error it is for the United States to try at this time in the history of the world to get back into the imperial business. For it does seem to me, indeed, that the United States is engaged now in the incredible folly of something like seeking to reinvent imperialism for the 21st century. But empire, the embodiment of force, violates equity on a global scale. No lover of freedom can give it support. And it is especially contrary to the founding principles of the United States. Covenants without the sword are but words, Hobbes said. But since then, the world has learned that swords without covenants are but empty bloodshed. Can cruise missiles build nations in Iraq or elsewhere? Does power still flow from the barrel of a gun or from a B-2 bomber? Can the world in the 21st century really be ruled from 35,000 feet? Modern peoples have the will to resist and the means to do so. Perhaps you've seen the news this morning. As you know, in Baghdad over the last several weeks there have been a series of devastating explosions. And now again in the last couple of days there have been explosions. But this time the American command has announced that we are the ones doing it. It turns out that we bombed some textile factory in the south of Baghdad. Hard to say why that happened. But these explosions cannot build democracy, not in Iraq and not in the United States, where democracy is also in danger. But the point I want to leave you with, finally, is not only that violence has become self-destructive and is futile, but that the antidote and cure, political action without violence, direct or indirect, revolutionary or reformist, American or other, has made its appearance and has shown its promise. May we apply it soon to our troubled country and the world. Thank you.
It's hard to believe that for 20 years now we've been waging peace at the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation, and during this period we've seen momentous changes in our world. We've seen the fall of the Berlin Wall, we've seen the breakup and dissolution of the former Soviet Union. We've seen the end of apartheid in South Africa. We've seen much that's good and also much that continues to challenge us. We're still faced with terribly serious dangers related to nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction, as must be clear to all of us. We're standing at an intersection of global inequities, of extremism, and of weapons of unprecedented power. It's an incendiary mix that makes the work of this foundation so important. I want to thank the foundation's directors. They do so much to assure that we achieve the goals that we've set out, the critical mission of this organization. I want to thank our incredible staff. They're enthusiastic, they're dedicated, they're energetic, they put in incredibly long hours, and they are working every day to try to build the kind of peaceful world that we're seeking. And I particularly want to call attention and single out Chris Pisonet and Sharon Rossell. Chris, who both of them have worked so hard to make this evening such a success. So it wouldn't happen without the kind of dedication that our staff puts in to this event and to every element of the Foundation's work. I also want to give a special thanks to our dinner chairs, Imogene Spence and Jill Dexter. Thank you. Finally, I want to thank all of you who have joined us in this effort and have given us support, encouragement, and help in meeting our goals. Thank you very, very much. I want to say a few words to the young people who are with us tonight. We want all of you young, and I imagine that there are some of you who weren't born yet when this foundation began. And I imagine others of you were toddlers when we began 20 years ago. So we're so happy to have you with us tonight. And we want you to know that your future matters. We want you to know that we're counting on you to play an active role in waging peace and in working for the elimination of nuclear weapons. We want you to be inspired by our awards this evening and by the words of our awardees. We want you too, in the future, to become peace leaders and world citizens. And most of all, we want you to know that we're counting on you to make a difference. The Foundation gives these awards because we believe that our time demands new heroes. We need heroes that work for peace, that work for justice, and that work for a better world. We've been giving the Peace Leadership Award now for 20 years. The World Citizenship Award is of more recent vintage, but among the recipients of the World Citizenship Award have been Ted Turner, Queen Noor of Jordan, and Robert Mueller, who's with us this evening. The concept of world citizenship reminds us of who we are and what we aspire to be. It reminds us of where we live on this planet. It reminds us that borders are artificial, something that the astronauts and the cosmonauts recognized very quickly as they looked back on Earth from outer space. It reminds us that we live on an extraordinarily unique and precious planet that deserves our love and our stewardship. It reminds us that as planetary citizens, we have both rights and responsibilities. We have the right to be treated with respect and with dignity, and we have the responsibility to assure that respect and dignity are accorded to everyone without regard to what they believe, to what they look like, or to where they live. Finally, we share a responsibility to pass the planet on intact to the next generation and the next and the next. And right now, that is a particularly difficult responsibility that's been placed in our hands. Our responsibilities extend beyond our immediate families to the human family and to generations yet unborn. It is to educate and advocate for these responsibilities that our foundation exists. The security of each of us depends upon the security of all of us. Our powerful technologies have made the stakes far too high to let any group of people anywhere in the world become disaffected to the point that they are willing to die, that they are willing to kill and to die for their particular cause. We must put an end to war before war puts an end to us. That is our challenge. To do this, we must build a structure of peace, and this requires us to become citizens of the world. This year's honoree for our World Citizenship Award is a man of enormous distinction. He is a singer and actor, and he is a great humanitarian. He has balanced his professional success with compassion and commitment to building a better world. He has stood at the crossroads of the most important social movements of our time, and he has always taken the path of human dignity. He has walked shoulder to shoulder with Martin Luther King Jr. and with Nelson Mandela and other great leaders of our time. He has served as a cultural advisor to the Peace Corps, appointed by President Kennedy in the 1960s. He had the idea for and set in motion the USA for Africa benefit that resulted in the Grammy Award-winning song, "We Are the World," and raised more than $50 million to fight hunger in Africa. He was also deeply involved in Hands Across America, a benefit for hungry Americans. He has received many, many honors and honorary degrees for his work. He is a man of song, whose voice and spirit soar. He was born in Harlem, raised in Jamaica, but is truly a citizen of the world. It is my great pleasure to present the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation's 2003 World Citizenship Award to Mr. Harry Belafonte.
I am deeply honored and privileged to be the recipient of the Citizen Award. It more than what it does for my ego and my self-esteem, I guess the most important thing about all of this is that it's validation. It validates the things that I work for and struggle for. It validates hundreds of friends that I have made, many of whom have passed on and others who still linger, and who most of the time are always on the cutting edge of what's new and what's happening. And in that context, we are sometimes caught in the wave of things that in their beginning are not very popular. As a matter of fact, to some citizens, they're just downright annoying. And many do not hesitate to let us know that, and others work tenaciously at putting more obstacles in our way because they see us as mischief makers. I do not know when I first started in a world of activism. It seems to me that many of us who are born in poverty have that characteristic as part of our DNA. Born to immigrants who came to America like other immigrants, except they were of color, with a great sense of hope for what America could offer and what they could do to find a life of dignity, and was their wish. Instead, unlike other immigrants, mostly the ones from Europe, America was not quite so yielding. It wasn't quite so generous. And they, coming from a life that was under the cruel experience of colonialism, they came to America thinking that the things that they had heard and the opportunities that existed here would be a place of hope that they came to. And that was not the way things turned out for them. My mother was, for all intent and purposes, a single parent. She had no formal education. She was a domestic worker. And she was part of a martyr of women and people who were trapped in the terrible dilemma and cruelty of the Great Depression. And in the midst of all the citizens in this country who struggled for a new day and a new order, and trying to find a new way to direct the politics of this nation and the social values of this nation, My mother, being caught up in all of this, was able to pull her children into the world of her thinking. The immediate characteristics of my childhood was not very different from a lot of other young people in my community. My father was an abuser. He was an alcoholic. He was an absentee parent. And my mother had the burden of struggling with her children and bringing them up while trying to make a living other than what home relief or the welfare system offered. And in the pursuit of our life, our lives, she decided that she would take us back to the Caribbean because certainly in that environment, as oppressive as much of it was still a safer place for us to be than in the streets of New York doing the wild things that we did when we were left alone. And so this shift to the Caribbean gave me an opportunity to see my family work on the plantations, the banana, the sugarcane, the grueling work, the difficulty that they had in trying to make ends meet. And I was forever aware of how similar their plight was to those who I grew up with and knew in the streets of New York and in Harlem in particular. My mother brought us back to the United States at the outbreak of the war in Europe. Not at the very beginning, because until England entered the war, my mother still thought that Jamaica was the best place for us to be. But the swiftness with which Hitler moved through Europe and how quickly other nations were conquered, everyone thought that England, this little island, would go in no time. And my mother, not being sophisticated enough, I guess, although that's an inappropriate word, she was very sophisticated in many ways. She was not as knowing about the international order. And she thought that, like many, that England would be conquered in no time, and what would happen to the peoples of the Caribbean and other places in the world that England dominated. And she thought that the best place for us would be back here in America. But when we got here, she was constant in her imparting information to us about what we should be and what we should aspire to, and where we should draw the line in terms of our own oppression. And in that deliverance, in that instruction, she pointed out that Adolf Hitler and what went on in Europe was not to be viewed as some distant adventure, but for us to look at it squarely in the midst of our own future, our own need, our own hopes, our own aspirations. And as difficult as things were in America racially, that we would ultimately be able to take care of that business. But first we had to lend ourselves and our support to the efforts being made by the Allied powers to overcome Hitler and Mussolini and Tojo. And so with this early instruction and being hauled off to meetings with her to hear Marcus Garvey and to listen to her interpret the news of the day, when I, finding life extremely difficult in my adolescence and my late formative years, decided to volunteer for the armed forces and worked during the Second World War in the United States Navy as a munitions loader. And in that work, I didn't do it just to get off the streets of New York and to find a place of discipline and to find an opportunity to perhaps move up the rungs of the ladder. I really joined also with a passion and the belief about all that we were told about democracy and what the future would hold for us and that by joining the armed struggle against fascism, we would, by the display of our commitment to that war and its victory, come back to an America that would be enlightened, would be more compassionate, would be more generous to its citizens of color. But when we came back, that was not the case. There was no generosity here. It was back to business as usual, and those who sat in the seats of power decided to actively display how serious they were about maintaining the status quo. And so we faced a rash of murders and beatings and arrests and violence throughout the length and breadth of the United States. Men like Isaac Woodard, one of the most decorated heroes of African American descent, who served in the European theater, had come back to this country having survived the battlefields of Europe, and on the day he was mustered out on his way back home to South Carolina to celebrate with his family, who were deeply rewarded and pleased at the fact that he survived, he got on a bus. And when that bus left from Fort Dix in New Jersey to go on down south, in the middle of the journey he was told by the driver that at this point in the journey you had to get in the back of the bus. And he said, "You don't understand that I've just come from a war that settled all such questions, and the back of the bus will be no more." And for that resistance, he was hauled off the bus, severely beaten, and both of his eyes were gouged out with the blunt end of a billy club from the sheriff. Isaac Woodard just died not too long ago. He died a broken man. He died as a guest of the benevolence of the state. He died with this great anonymity, but he lingered forever in the memories of those of us who did not fear the same fate, but he inspired us to pick up the new phase of the struggle against oppression in a life that has gone from the most vivid memories of the Depression in the 1930s and all that my family and others did in the organizing of labor and trying to perfect an America and its promise of a democracy, into the World War and the constant bombardment of images and stories about the Jews and the gas chambers and Dachau and Auschwitz and Buchenwald and what was going on in the world at large. And then all of my friends from the developing world, all those men and women of color from Asia and Africa who linked up with the Allied forces with the same passion and the same belief that we as African Americans hooked up with our armed forces. They fought in the British Expeditionary Forces. They fought for the French. They fought for the Dutch. They fought for even the Portuguese who were not in the war, and others. And at the end of their term of service, they discovered also that England and France and Holland and all had no intentions of doing anything to reward them with this new sense of democracy that the world was celebrating or expecting to celebrate. And when I looked about me and I saw all those Asians and Africans who were so much like us, I instantly understood our commonality. And in that commonality, I began to read and to reach out. And much to my blessing, people, for reasons I have never quite understood, but I have never denounced it, or not denounced, but has never challenged it. I'm not quite sure why Eleanor Roosevelt sought me out when she did, and at the threshold of my own ascendancy as an artist, brought me into her world and into the intimate surroundings of her hopes and aspirations and her beliefs and struggles. And in her mentorship, watched her when she tried to deliver the articles that she had helped create on human rights in the United Nations, and what she did in reaching out to the socialist bloc and to the Russians, and how many missions I went on with her as an artist as well as a participant in her groups. What I learned from her and the people that I met that helped inspire and set focus for where I had to go and what I wanted to be. And then in the theater, when I decided to be an artist, what a stroke of good luck that of all the places I petitioned to attend, it should have been the New School of Social Research and Erwin Piscata, who was our instructor, a man who came from social theater, political theater, who saw art not just as an instrument that should show life as it is, but an instrument that should show life as it should be. And because of his life with Bertolt Brecht and Max Reinhardt, the kind of theater that they had created before Hitler took over, brought him to America, and in his instruction and his enlightenment, he showed me art as a social force, as an instrument of power. And in my class, how blessed and how fortunate that in our youth and our absence of celebrity, none of us ever suspecting that we would make it. But nevertheless, there I was in my first few years with my classmates Marlon Brando, Walter Matthau, Rod Steiger, B. Arthur, Tony Curtis, or Bernie Schwartz as we called him. And here we were, looking at life, looking at theater, looking at what we could do to make our mark, and how blessed we were that Erwin Piscata led us to a deeper study of the works of Shakespeare, a great revolutionary, and a man whose work was constantly filled with rebellion and poetry and illumination, and how fortunate we were to know Chekhov and George Bernard Shaw and Sean O'Casey, and then to come upon instructors like Arthur Miller and Clifford Odets and Lee Strasberg. And how wonderful that our class should have been the first in the American cultural scene to introduce Jean-Paul Sartre to the American cultural scene by him giving us the privilege of being the first to perform his plays in America. Agamemnon, The Flies, No Exit. What a world, what a place to be. And in my first performance as a young student, what a joy that at the end of one evening, a man came to see the play called Julian the Paycock by Sean O'Casey, a great Irish writer. And he was an African American of enormous credentials. And he sat and watched the play, and at the end, he stayed behind to give us the benefit of his thoughts and instruction. And he, from that moment on, not only became a part of my life, but for whatever the reasons were, he embraced me and brought me into his fold as well. Paul Robeson was his name. And through him, I got to sit with Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, who then led me on to others, to Kwame Nkrumah from Africa, from Lutuli, the great chief from South Africa, the first African Nobel winner. What a place to be in for a kid who was a high school dropout. What an environment with which to be able to draw sustenance and thought for what to do with myself and where to put my being. The great coincidence of success was the I guess the greatest stroke of fortune. Those platforms gave me a constituency, gave me a place from which to be heard. And it was Paul Robeson who said, among a number of things, who said, when he heard that I had decided to turn to music as an offering, he came and he said, "Harry, get them to sing your song, and they will want to know who you are." So with that rather remarkable thought sitting squarely in my sights, I found a chance to do mischief. And I designed ways in which to do the subtlest of things that would wind up having some of the most profound moments of impactation on the culture of America and the world. Day-o, day-o. Daylight come and me want go home. Me said, daylight come and me want go home. Get them to sing your song, and they will want to know who you are. Thanks to an Austrian Jew by the name of George Marek, who also embraced me. He was the head of RCA, a man of profound thinking. He was a great student of the classics. He wrote about the life of Beethoven and Schubert, and he was touched by genius because it was on his watch and through his personal choice that Leontine Price was signed to the label. And a young man that I just knew would never make it by the name of Elvis Presley. And myself, and a host of others. And it was George Marek who said, although we have a contract and there's some minimal requirements that we ask of you, if you're smart enough, you will know how to use us. And I hope that you would not hesitate to do just that. And if you find it difficult in the daily course of business with this organization, do not hesitate to call on me and let me hear what you have in mind, and let's see where we can take it. When I sang the songs of the Caribbean, it was just the first part of a journey. Get them to sing your song, and they'll want to know who you are. And when I came to America, I remembered the way in which most Americans viewed us from the Caribbean. Most white folks looked upon us as an interesting group. How charming we were. How sweet. How wonderful we were in our rather passive characteristics. How simple we were. How we loved the simple things of life. How we never rocked the boat too much, and how we were so accommodating. How we were so simple. How wonderful and humorous that we were so preoccupied with our sexuality, especially the men. And I listened to all these things, and I saw us in a very different way. And how do you change those perceptions? Get them to sing your song, and they'll want to know who you are. And so one of the first offerings was Dale. Work all night on a drink of rum was what my parents did. Come, Mr. Tallyman, tally our banana. How much we relied on the United Fruit Company and our managers who would count the tonnage and the hands of banana that were delivered because we were paid by the bunch. How often my aunts and cousins used to carry the food to the men at night who worked the night shift because it was easier than the day shift. It was cooler. How all of these things which made up our people Marcus Garvey, the constant rebellion that was going on in us in these islands for our struggle against colonialism, how much of it was not known, how much of it was swept away by the interpretations of Eurocentric view. And so it was our task to put another view on the table. And so one day when I woke up, it was an interesting thing for me to see 50,000 Japanese singing Deo. In this, using myself as a vehicle and a communicator to tell the story of others and other cultures and other oppressions. How wonderful it was for me to, as an African American of Caribbean descent, to stand on the stages of Germany and lead 50,000 Germans in Hava Nagila. How lustily they sang it. How loudly they wanted themselves to be heard. How interesting it must have been for many of them when they said, I wonder where that song came from and what it's about. Get them to sing your song and they'll want to know who you are. And then, what good fortune for the Peace Corps. The earliest days of my encounters with the Kennedy family. What happened can be read in some interesting books and important books that have chronicled those moments, like Parting the Waters by Taylor Branch, one of the best history books on the last half of the 20th century in America, told through the prisms of those of us who were in the civil rights movement. How wonderful that in our discussions and exchanges, he should have understood how important our movement was and how I was able to push that envelope along with Harris Wofford and others. What we had to do, because Dr. King instructed us to take one of the Kennedys and win them to our cause. A man whom we thought no such day was possible. Bobby Kennedy was a lawyer. He served McCarthy. He hounded thousands of people and did the work of those who were villains in our time. And when he became the Attorney General, we saw it as a dark day for us. And while we bemoaned that fact, it was Dr. King who said, we may look upon him and know him to be what you have all defined, but I suggest to you there may be something else in him. And it is your responsibility to find that something else. Find his moral center. And when you do, bring him to our cause. And I dare say, with no bragging intended, we did make a difference in what Bobby Kennedy became because of what our movement was about, because of how we were able to bring him into the womb of poverty and racism and let him look into the faces of the white poor people in the mountains of West Virginia and Appalachia, and what he did when he went into Alabama and the black community, and what he did when he slowly began to use the power of the Attorney General and the Justice Department to serve our movement. What a remarkable human being he became. And the Peace Corps, what an opportunity it was, because it wasn't just so much looking at what Americans would do when they went to the developing world and spending 2 years in the service of people in the faraway places. I thought very strongly about what it would mean for all those Americans to come back and to be able to go to their communities in Wyoming and in Nevada and in New York and Florida and tell people of the beauty of diversity, what remarkable things lay in the differences of people, how much of us were in them. And if we could just spend enough time looking through the prisms of those who served in the Corps, we might find an America of the future that would be armed with so much truth and so much insight that it could help charter a course that would have us in a place of great delight in our future. And with that, I went marching off to places in Africa that were not yet independent. Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah I knew because Robeson introduced me to him, and through Dr. Du Bois. But then there were others, Julius Nyerere, Tom Mboya, Jomo Kenyatta, on and on and on, Sekou Touré, Senghor. How many of these young men and women who came to the United States for the first time as students, the role that many of us played in creating scholarships, putting them through these institutions, and how lucky for us that many of them went back to Africa and became some heads of state, some ministers of government, and when I walked in, I was given a lot of privilege, a lot of access, a lot of places at the dinner table. And I listened to them exchange views on some very sensitive subjects and came up with ideas that sparked my own sense of what it meant to be part of the international community. How remarkable it was to be able to not only know these people, but to be able to share moments in their struggle for independence and the victories they experienced by bringing their nations to the dawning of independence. And how wonderful it was to imagine that with Kennedy and with Johnson and the way in which America was headed, that we could look towards the 21st century with one of the greatest periods in human development civilization had ever known. And after all that time of being arrested and going to these places and delving into places that were not anointed by the approval of consensus, or the flack we took for doing those things that only communists would do, and only malcontents would do, and only those who wished our nation wrong and evil would do. What a journey. Knowing all along as we watched one thing after another capitulate, watching Africa become independent, watching Asia come into its own, watching us go through the wars in Korea and Vietnam, and learning each time out that war was just not the answer. What it was to watch the people of Vietnam do what they did, not only to Japanese, who were their first conquerors, then on to the French, who were their second conquerors, then on to us. What a remarkable thing that of all the places in the world, that the leader of that nation, Ho Chi Minh, should have looked to in the first instance was the United States of America. What a missed opportunity that instead of pulling him in to our fold, bringing him into the table of honor and equality and having a debate and a discussion and doing analysis, we should have so rudely and cruelly rejected him, as we had done with Fidel Castro, as we had done with Nelson Mandela and so many others. All of these people. Ho Chi Minh was a Jeffersonian student. As a matter of fact, if you read the Constitution, the Vietnamese Constitution, it's written after our preamble as well. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. He loved Jefferson and saw in America great hope. So did Fidel Castro. So did so many others. So did Allende in Chile. And as I unfold all this that I've been exposed to, it was with some great sense of anticipation that I had discussions with my wife and my family, and I am absolutely delighted that my daughter Shari and her husband Sam Behrens, the only fascist in our group, even though he is Jewish, that they've come here tonight to share this evening with me and to it was the family fantasy that by the time I'd reached, a friend of mine once said, life comes in 8 cycles, in 8 cycles of 10. And at this particular event, he said, Harry, after his 5th drink, he says, I just want you to know, you just used up 7 of them. Thanks a lot. With that in mind, I had always known that by the time I turned 70, I would be in the Caribbean, on the beach, hopefully under a coconut tree, watching the sights as they would parade up and down the beach, remembering my history, running off every now and then to put a note or two on the paper, to just really celebrate and be full of joy and a sense of accomplishment because the world was free of nuclear weapons. There were no more borders, no need for passports. Doctors Without Borders were now doctors who really were without borders, and medicine and education and everything was just on the table, and the world was feasting at it. Nothing in my fantasy suggested that at the age of 70 we would be in the world in which we're in, facing so much of the same dilemmas, trying to overcome so much of the same hurdles. Here we are, yet again at war. And most people in this country only know about the war that's on the front pages, or the one that's you see on CNN or Peter Jennings and ABC. We talk very little about the over 3 million people who have already been murdered in the Sudan, in a war that's been going on longer than any other war on the planet. But we don't hear too much about them. After all, they're just happy natives, and that's the way they are. They're used to that. They're very primitive, that Neanderthal kind of behavior. And, we Europeans, we Americans, we the fortunate ones, we'll just wait for them to catch up, and when they're ready and have earned our preoccupation, our thoughts, we will go help them in some way. And of course there's Colombia and all that we've done to crucify that nation, turning it from a rich agricultural productive state into a beggar nation, forcing tens of thousands of children to come into the world deformed, filled with malnutrition, all from the adventures that we have in the war that we are sustaining with our troops, with our weapons. All that goes on in so many places in the world that we hear very little about. The world is engulfed in war. All that's going on in this struggle with the United Nations to end borders. How many more borders are now being created? How, after all this time, after walking through the deserts, the Negev, dining in Beersheba, in a kibbutz with Moshe Dayan, talking to him and his colleagues about the hope of Israel's future and what it meant to have peace with Palestine, what the promise was then in the formation of this new and young state, what it meant as a new democracy, what a wonderful experiment going on. When I sent my brother there to live, to look at this new experiment and be touched by what he would learn to come back here and to give instruction. How wonderful that Dr. King, in our daily exchanges, should have seen so much in the future of Israel and the future of so many other nations that were in formation. What a wonderful thing that he did. How sad that he was taken away from us in the way in which he was taken, and how sad we have come to a world that we are now experiencing. But, and I will conclude, 3 days before he was murdered, Dr. King was in New York, in my home, where much time was spent because it was his place for anonymity. It was where he did a lot of his writing. It was where he framed many of his speeches. And we had an intimacy in moments of thinking and reflection. And on this particular night, just a few days before he went to Memphis, he seemed very troubled. He had moments of being troubled quite often, but this one had a peculiar look to it. And I said to him, what's troubling you, Martin? And he said, you know, Harry, we've worked hard and long for our cause to end segregation, to fix that, and now we're moving full force into the future of integration. And hopefully we'll be able to shift from what we're doing to the new campaign for economic rights and economic freedom and to get rid of economic oppression. He said, but I'm troubled. And I said, what troubles you? He said, I've come to believe that in our moment, looking for integration, I think we're integrating into a burning house. And to hear him say this, it wasn't that we had not thought about it. How do you shape America? How do you shape its citizens in the wake of all that had gone on and had gone on before us and during our day? And after some exchange on it, the last thing he said as he was leaving to come to Memphis, he had to go to Atlanta first. I said, listen, in this view that you have of us integrating into a burning house, how do you suggest we fix it? He said, it's just very simple. We're all going to have to become firemen. And as abstract as that may have appeared to be in its prophecy, I never realized how prophetic that moment really was, because we are living in that burning house. We are living with pollution. We're living with the devastation of this planet in such a momentum that many astute and well-meaning scientists will tell you they are very concerned and they're almost sure that the process is not reversible, that somehow we're caught in this thing that will not end. And then, of course, all the wars that are going on and how frightening it is to have a head of state stand before the peoples of America and the peoples of the world and in his appetite for war make remarks like, bring them on. What it's really quite hard to describe in any word that comes to mind that seems sufficient enough. But it is a tragedy of enormous proportions. But in the face of all of that, given how many wars we have been in, given how many times we sat at the brink of annihilation, how many times nuclear force was a threat in the days of the Cold War and some days since, how often nations have fought for independence and come upon, instead of democracy, come upon long periods of tyranny and oppression and have gone back to the drawing board and reconstructed and redefined their way. How wonderful that in that world so many nations should be on a new course. If you take a look at Brazil, what's going on in this remarkable place, if you take a look at Argentina, if you take a look at Ecuador, if you take a look at Venezuela, and if you take a look at what's going on in Mexico and a few other places, if you take a look at what's going on in the new Africa, those who are not students of the continent and know very little about that place, as does most of America, carry that unfortunate part of its flaw. There was a place called the OAU, Organization of African Unity. It is now for many a relic, but it was kind of the United Nations of Africa. It was a forum in which people would meet of African persuasion and who would come to some conclusion about things that were the best for Africa's interest. And it faltered. It faulted seriously primarily from what the Cold War did, the KGB and the CIA and all that went on, and the overthrow of governments and the murder of Lumumba and the jailing of Mandela and all those things that destabilized this continent that most people think of as just primitive, and all of its people are used to cannibalism, etc., etc. How remarkable that today that same OAU is now called the AU. How wonderful it is that all the new leaders, the new heads of state, those who had inherited this Africa from the founding fathers who fought those revolutions, how wonderful it is to sit in the midst of their forum and hear them articulate a sense of the future of the world, in which America is hugely a part of it, but in a very different way, because they no longer have any use for the IMF. They do not like the World Bank. They've watched many of the nations that belong to this place who came with a great sense of promise. Some, no question that their future was going to be the most productive, like Senegal. And now, because of the IMF and American policy, mostly, not exclusively, but mostly, these places have now become beggar nations. And they live in poverty and squalor and hate and the child soldiers and the killing of one another. And all the wars that go on in Africa, once they could be ascribed to wars of liberation, and now it is completely defined as wars of greed, diamonds, gold, turf, etc., etc., etc. But in the midst of all of this, there is an awakening. Everywhere I go, I find mostly youth. Everywhere I go, I hear new ideas, new thoughts, new utterances. How unfortunate that they do not know each other as well as they should, because communications and those who control and own it do us no such service. As a matter of fact, they'd rather have us believe we don't exist. They'd rather have us believe that we are somehow a relic of the past, and that the only thing that is important today is globalization, trade agreements, and the banks, and all of the institutions that come to carry so much influence, that Enron and Halliburton and Rumsfeld and Ashcroft and all these people are the real voice of the future and the hope of an America that will spread democracy around the globe. Well, I think a lot of people have come to see it all very differently. And in that moment of understanding that there's something terribly wrong, they're looking for opportunity to do things in a very different way. Herein sits our chance. Herein sits what I delight in. Here's where I spend most of my time. I am delighted to see the young people who are here at the invitation of our sponsoring organization, the Nuclear Foundation. But it is interesting to me that you have to take note of their presence. Somehow that suggests there is not a rhythm of the kind of familiarity there should be in how they work with you on a daily basis. No criticism here, just an observation, because you don't stand alone. I can't tell you how many institutions that come from the left or the other side of political thought today who are guilty of only talking about the youth as an abstract, but have not yet discovered how to integrate them as a full part of our daily menu. But I go to the places where the youth languish, and that takes me into the prisons of America. I'm forever in Tracy, California, among the gladiators that languish in the prisons there, who make up a large portion of the Mexican youth of the state. That theater in Tracy is the headquarters for the Mexican Mafia. What it means to go in there and work with Warden Finn and those men on a rehabilitation program that carries more than just the polite hope of them going out and breaking the rhythm of criminality in some abstract way. We give them fundamental, tangible things with which to work that brings them out not only somewhat reformed, but gives them a political platform on which to begin to work immediately towards changing those people who govern their communities, the legislation, registration, and they do it with a force and an energy that we know very little about. Same thing in LA County Jail. The United States of America has the largest prison population in the world. Much of that population are young. Most of the young are African Americans and Hispanics. We have more young African American men and women in the prisons of America than we have in the universities of America. And we, as a matter of public policy, build more prisons than we build schools or healthcare centers, than we build any. And we are now turning, as quickly as possible, this piece of real estate venture to the private sector, so that they may keep the prisons filled and extract profit from how they deal with the prison culture and the prison economy. All this goes on, and we're in a struggle against it. No one can say, I really don't know quite what to do. Our canvas is filled with so much to pick from. But it's finding a way in which we all come together in some place to let our voices be heard in some marvelously defined way by the number of us who exist. Just recently, when you looked around America and the world, you saw hundreds of thousands of people who turned out into the streets to let their voices be heard against our adventure in Iraq. And to many other people, somehow that has just ebbed away and blended once again into the landscape, and you don't get to see that energy being displayed with any great sense of immediacy. Certainly there's very little activity in many of the campuses that I go to, at least activity as compared to what it was with the campuses in the 1960s and the 1950s, when the campuses led America. What happened to make that change? What happened to youth? What happened to the information they were being given? How did all of what we worked for so hard become co-opted? And how do we regain it? Dr. King, Eleanor Roosevelt, Fannie Lou Hamer, Ella Baker, Bobby Kennedy, name it all. They left this place with a great sense of hope that the America that we all dream of would be a reality in our lifetime. Well, the 20th century has come and gone, but the 21st century does not have to be the same. Each century something new happens that makes it all a little different and a little better. It was Teddy Roosevelt who said, and I paraphrase, that when those who are responsible for the leadership of state begin to move in villainous ways, when they begin to destroy the fabric of what it is that our nation is held together with, when they violate the Constitution of our nation and begin to do things that are false to our dream and our hopes, it is incumbent upon every citizen, by right, but also by responsibility, to challenge that administration, to raise their voice in vigorous dissent, and to change the way in which the state is doing business. And those who fail to do that should be charged with patriotic treason. And I am hopeful that on my epitaph it will say, he cannot be charged with patriotic treason.